do now is look to see how the impact of living through a crisis varies with your characteristics. So we're going to go back to the baseline exposure measure where we just measured did you live through a crisis or not, and look at how education, time in the US, and citizenship affect the results. So what you see is that the effect of living through a crisis is really concentrated among immigrants with low education. So this is less than high school education. So if you have more than a high school degree or more, the effect of being living through a crisis is wiped out by education, basically. So there's sort of no effect if you're a high education immigrant. So in some sense, you can think of this as you're living in a country, you get a signal for free about the safety of banking systems. Some people come to the US and say, oh, I need to update my signal. I'm in a completely different institutional environment. It's easier and cheaper for people with high education to do that. For people with low education, it may be too costly to update that signal, or they may not be able to do, sort of say, oh, it's a different institutional environment, there's different rules.
Sorry, couldn't it be that they have low education precisely because they lived through a crisis? So as in, they went to school and their parents' bank account got wiped out, and therefore they had to drop from school or something and start working at home.
That's a possibility. We haven't explored whether or not education would be.
Because it's then sort of because your identifying assumption before was that you can take your wealth from the country, right, from which you migrate. That's sort of, you said you want to disentangle wealth and confidence. And what you're using there is that you can take your wealth from El Salvador to the US. Is that correct?
I don't think I'm using that you can't take your wealth. It's that I have measured wealth in the US. So to the extent that you've been able to take your wealth with you, I'm measuring it. So I have wealth quartiles or wealth quintiles in the regression. So I can observe it.
No, so what I'm thinking though is that education is sort of like your human wealth.
Yes. Which you can take with you, and then that might, yeah. So that's an interesting idea. We can look to see whether or not living through a crisis affects completed years of schooling for cohorts in the country of origin. I know there's some work on that for Indonesia, and I know at least at the time of the crisis there were people who did take their kids out of school. I don't know if it was for a long enough time period to actually affect completed years of schooling or completed years of schooling for our categories, but that's an interesting idea. Yeah, so low education could potentially be the result of the crisis. When we look at how long you've been in the US, for each additional year that you've been in the US, the effect of living through a crisis goes down a little bit by about a percentage point, a little less than a percentage point. Okay, so that's kind of comforting. That suggests that we're not picking up something totally crazy here that's fixed through time or immutable. I would expect this to decay with time as you've lived in the US longer. And then again, when you look at recent migrants, so these are people who come within three years of the survey, you can see that the effect of having lived through a crisis is much larger for them. So they've had less time to sort of have experience with U.S. institutions and maybe update their beliefs about how banks and other institutions work. And then when we look at the impact of people who are naturalized citizens in the U.S., we don't find any effect here. Okay, so it doesn't look like there's a big difference for people who have made the decision to become citizens. I mean, so this is clearly an endogenous variable in some sense, but we don't find any effect there. Okay, so they've invested more in learning about U.S. institutions or have family connections that allowed them to make that decision. So now we want to look at country characteristics, and I will just jump to the regressions again. So the impact of living through a crisis is smaller for people who come from countries that are more developed. And here we measure GDP per capita, average GDP per capita over a 10-year period. So we're just trying to get kind of general level of development. It's not significant, but it looks like countries that have more developed financial systems, that would mitigate the crisis effect a little bit. And then we also looked at some measures of the penetration of banking in the country of origin, so the number of bank branches per capita. We didn't find any effect there. Now that could work two ways. That could be a measure of the level of financial development, but it could also be a measure of financial market participation in the country of origin. Because one thing that would be really interesting to know is, these people who have been exposed to the crisis, did they literally lose their life savings or have it inflated away or whatever happened? Or did they hear about that happening to a neighbor? Or did they read about it in the newspaper? In Mexico, it's estimated that something like 75% of people don't have a checking account, don't have any bank account. So you wouldn't expect this to be happening through direct exposure. It would be happening through your perceptions about how banks work, not necessarily because you've literally lost money. So in any case, we don't find any effect though of the number of bank branches per capita, or in bank freedom. So this is a measure of how easy it is to open new bank accounts, open new bank branches, whether or not banks can go into activities like investment banking and so on. So how sort of open and free the banking system is. This last one looks at the quality of institutions. So this is a KKZ index of governance. So this is this index. I think it goes from 1 to 10 that measures the quality of institutions by some scale in the country of origin. And coming from a place with good institutions seems to kind of wipe out the negative effect of living through a crisis. So, obviously crises are less common in places with good institutions, so there's some interesting dynamics at work there. This isn't set up to do this, but one of the things that the current crisis kind of brings up is, so if you're in a country which has good institutions, say the US, Western Europe, and then something really disastrous happens that's sort of unexpected and improbable, does that affect your confidence more or less? Is that kind of a blip, and then people get back to normal, and I can trust institutions again? Or is that have a really profound effect on your beliefs because you thought things were good and it turns out you were completely wrong? So that we can't really explore with this, but I think that's probably a very important question for the current situation. Okay. So now we're going to look at some variation in the crisis characteristics. So one thing that's possible, you could have a financial crisis by itself, or you could have a financial crisis and a recession. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't. So we looked to see if there was a different effect when there was also a GDP crisis, which we defined as 3 years in a row of negative GDP growth. So something really severe. We're trying to keep this crisis thing going. So what looks like happens is that just a banking crisis by itself lowers your participation in checking accounts by about 6%. But if there's also a GDP crisis at the same time, so some very severe contraction, then that's adding to this effect. When we look to see, how low was GDP growth during the crisis, we don't find any differential effect by how bad things got in terms of GDP growth in the country. We also don't find anything significant in terms of how long the crisis lasts. Okay, so you would think maybe that longer crises have bigger impacts, but there's just nothing significant here, so it's possible, but we can't tell.